plan for us really is to capture the market here in Australia in the first step, with New Zealand as well, and then see where we go from there as a base. That's the imminent work. And our focus here really is around building products that are unique, built for and with the Australian marketplace, addressing both residential and commercial, industrial, small scale behind the meter options. And that's really us for the next 2 years, and focusing, as I said before, on batteries as well as vehicle to grid as a prime driver, because we view vehicle to grid, or basically EVs, just as batteries on wheels that might or might not be connected to the grid at any given point in time. They're no different to everything else we do. That's our focus point, and that will keep us very busy over the next 2 years.
Absolutely. But then, while everybody is into this rush of subsidy coming in, technology changing, people are opting out, where do you think it takes us, say 2030, which is less than 5 years away? What's your vision? How does the landscape look like? Because if you ask someone 10 years back about solar power, they say, Australia, now Australia is a very different place because of solar. The energy is coming through literally people's ears, right? What you do with all the excess. So where do you see how the battery will change that landscape for Brisbane when the Olympics comes?
There's an excellent question on the Olympics. We're on a journey right now, an irreversible journey from my perspective, to a distributed grid. So as the fossil fuel power stations actually get decommissioned over the next probably 10 odd years, that's the schedule we're looking at, the grid will need to completely change. And we're on that pathway. There's obviously significant amounts of work with the federal government has incentives on large scale capital deployments of utility scale renewable energy solutions, wind, solar, as well as batteries. And there's a very large pipeline of that as well for Australia. If even only 50% of that pipeline comes through, then we're well set. We're still not far enough though. So there's a significant need for us to harness the smaller scale assets that are in play. So the rooftop systems, household batteries, the EVs, so that we can get to where we need to be to operate the grid as a distributed grid. I think the next 5 years we'll see significant regulatory change. The current regulatory system does not sustain this type of engagement. It does not sustain the capabilities that are needed for every household to participate as an active player in the market. And we're already seeing some of those changes. The changes in some of the local jurisdictions, for example, here in Queensland, the fact that you can send energy across the grid during certain times in the day without paying network tariffs, both transmission as well as local distribution network tariffs, is fantastic, and something that I really would like to see everywhere in the NEM and in the WEM. There are other changes that we talked about this briefly in our other podcast about the flexibility capacity marketplaces, about firming capacity requirements that gentailers are opening up to aggregated asset providers. So all of these are going to enable new ways for households to use their assets and make more money, while at the same time providing supporting services for the grid, enabling that transition. So where does this put us in 2030, for example? I would expect the retailers, as we're familiar with them, are not going to provide services the way they're doing today. I tend to say retailers as we know it are going to disappear, and it's a little more harsh to actually use that wording, but I think it's probably true. And you can see clearly with Origin and AGL, they're on that journey already. They're looking to build alternative structures to engaging with customers. The VPP activities Origin has and AGL have are clear indicators in that direction. The EV activities Origin has and AGL both have are also clear indicators. The transition to operating large-scale utility assets in conjunction with these aggregated distributed assets is clear. You can see new players like Amber or Local Volts or Flow Power playing in that space as well. And the traditional, if you like, second-tier retailers who are not moving along, playing an increasingly less visible role. Those changes, they're going to creep up on us, and I think there's going to be some step changes in here, and some of those will remove current players from the board. But if you ask people in 5 years how they get their electricity, I think it'll be substantially different to how it is today.
Absolutely. Now, in that process, the psyche that we have, the cent per kilowatt hour mentality that we have has to change, because cent per kilowatt hour came from the fact that every kilowatt hour you need to chuck in some more coal or some oil. As we move towards a zero marginal cost world, should not the electricity tariff be like what we have been doing broadly for internet, flat monthly charge, when everyone has batteries? it's going to be load curve has to be very flat, no? Somehow that fluctuation will go. What's your thought on that?
I'd love to see that happen. In the current structure for the markets, that's impossible to achieve. The challenge we're going to be facing is that, for example, at this point in time, who are the primary customers and the beneficiaries of the cheaper home battery program? To be very honest with you, it's going to be the top 20, 30% of the population here in Australia, those that have appropriate disposable income and are pairing it with the subsidies to then build out those assets. And that's good because there's benefit in it both for them as well as for the grid as a whole. However, it's not going to impact the renters. It's not going to provide solutions for those that are in the lower socioeconomic areas. Now, the problem we have here is how do we make those assets that are being deployed by the more to-do people available across all of the electricity users of Australia? And that really requires significant regulatory change. It requires all of these enablements that I talked about before. And that's my key worry. I don't know how long that's going to take. And I have the distinct feeling that there is still a lot of forces at work here who are trying to maximize the time it takes to get there.
Yes, they will. The incentives are like that. But having said that, if you think what's the fundamental of the wholesale electricity market was, the demand changes, you bring the next marginal cost generator, and then the price can go up. As the increased demand response get addressed by batteries, whether at source or at the system level, it will dampen those fluctuations. So I don't know whether the current market design can continue, wholesale electricity market design, if we have storage in the system, because the fundamental of the wholesale electricity market was electricity cannot be stored, demand and supply has to be matched instantly.
The challenge I think we'll be facing here is the cost contribution to having a grid operated overall. So whereas right now, or in the past, it was the generation cost that was a key driver for this, it's increasing the cost of operating the grid. That's a key driver for the cost of the residential household. And now you're getting to the point of all of those rich people that are putting batteries in place no longer actually need the grid. The question now is, how do we make those assets available and how do we utilize the grid to leverage that for everyone in the industry? The approach of saying, you've got, I don't know, let's say a fixed fee, you pay $30 a month and you use electricity. So it's like a flat fee, your internet service, data, regardless of the amount of data you use. That's easy to say, given the way the cost is distributed here and operating the grid assets. It requires, as I said before, these regulatory changes around how do you manage locally? What do you do for dynamic operating envelopes? The point that we made before is you want to be able to get to a 0-0 option, but you don't want to do that necessarily on your NMI basis. You want to do that potentially based on your grid infrastructure on a transformer or feeder or sub-feeder basis. How do you enable that? How do you enable peer-to-peer trading as a critical component to make that happen? How do you then automate that? Because you know as well as I do that you don't want to sit around and go, oh, I'm going to buy my electricity from Fred over here today because he's got too much and I need to click that button. No, you don't. You want electricity to just work the way it does today. So you need to automate that particular process. And as I said, this requires software solutions, which are to a large degree already happening, but it also requires that regulatory change. At this point, I can't imagine what that looks like because there are so many things that need to change in how a DNSP is operated and actually incentivized to drive grid operations, how the market operator works, how you can actually trade in an environment like that, both locally as well as across a region, as well as nationally in the NEM. Those are the things that I know a number of people are pushing, but there's active resistance to at all levels. Pretty much every one of them is pushing against that, which is understandable if you look at who's actually in control of these organizations right now.
Yeah, these characters will change because the term stranded asset will come in. I come from that long back. I was part of the Victorian privatization team, worked with Jeffrey Kennett at the time, our premier, you'd remember, and I was the pricing manager at the Essential Services Commission. But those days when Victoria was privatized, we brought in 5 distribution companies. So we said, how do we make it equal? Okay, write up the asset values in City Power and Solaris at that time, and I forgot which, and United Energy, and write down the value of the rural areas so that there is a subsidy built in forever. And I know those structural reform may be difficult now because all the assets are in private hands. So those time it was all state owned. But eventually, as technology changes, there'll be a lot of stranded assets coming in, as you mentioned. People will say, I don't need the grid anymore. Somehow, grid owners will keep on saying, oh, it's a regulatory bargain we got. You have to give me it. But it will come to a tipping point. They will also appreciate, their shareholders have to appreciate that there need to be some asset written off, maybe agree to a glide path, how that will, because technology will force us to get there, no? And the people who are complaining today, those will be retired out of the system, but the new generation will have a different look. I think it needs to be a fundamental change, not driven bottom up, maybe top down, as the shareholders changes, governments changes, as people are more aware, saying this is an obsolete system. We cannot keep on feeding the beast where the grid charges are way more than my generation costs, and I don't need the grid. I don't know. I'm very hopeful that will come.
I don't think we have an option. I think that's the critical piece to keep in mind. We are in a position here in Australia that we're already making these changes happen, and they must happen. I'm a little less clear on the view that the change will come from the top. The discussions we have tend to be at the top level with people who are more risk averse.
They will change.
I appreciate that view, but it's a hard one to do. It's a political problem where you're basically moving into a situation where you're replacing a known system and a known way of operating a system, which minimizes the risk to that system, so minimizes the chance of a blackout, with something where you're playing a statistical game, working in an environment where there is a non-zero chance of a blackout, and it is potentially higher than the current way the system is operating. That frightens people. It's also something that's easy to attack from a political perspective. So if any one of the two parties that are currently politically driving what's going on here in Australia makes that decision, it becomes an easy target. You can immediately say, hey, you're endangering the future of Australia and what it stands for in terms of its energy security by making this choice. And understanding how complex the system is, it's hard to explain to the voting public. And that's always the critical issue here. It takes principled politicians to make a decision like that, knowing full well that they become attackable. I don't think we're in a situation like that, where this is a choice that can be made by any of these parties, even if it must happen. I wouldn't at all be surprised if we need some sort of catastrophic impact before a decision gets made.